morning. So I have looked at this presentation exactly twice in my nice printout here. So sorry if I fumble through this. I've been with the Nature Conservancy for 8.5 years, working mostly in the Verde on developing water markets. I've also worked in Oregon on water transactions and worked quite a bit with Susan as she's developing the Colorado River Basin water transactions program for the Nature Conservancy. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the Conservancy is doing around water transactions and development of water markets. We're not doing this work alone. I think a lot of folks are involved in this room, but also our partners in Trout Unlimited, Natural Resource Conservation Service. So we have a diverse group of partners. So, because I feel like maybe you guys have not talked enough, can someone please just shout out what is it that all water users want? More water? Cleaner water? We think they want water security. It's great to get more water, but it's also good to get an amount of water that you know is coming. So if you know you're going to get 3 acre-feet a year, you can plan around 3 acre-feet a year. If you're a municipality, you're planning in millions of gallons per day. If you know how many you have, you can plan for that. It's nice to get extra, but if you get less than you're expecting, it's very hard to work with that plan. So water security is pretty important if you're a farmer, if you're a municipal water manager. It's also really important if you're a river. Knowing how much water is there determines how big your channel is, it determines what's living there, it determines how riparian areas grow. So how do you get to water security? We think it takes a lot of different tools and partnerships. So the tools can include transactions, it's the legal framework by which you know how much water you're getting, it's infrastructure to actually divert it from the channel or pump it from the ground wherever you're getting your water. And then partnerships, we can work with landowners, we work with municipalities, but as we develop these relationships and partnerships, trust, I think, is a key element in how we work together. So we have to build trusting relationships in order to have true partnerships where we're working together. So just to give you a look at Colorado Basin, I'm guessing everybody knows generally what it looks like. Lower Basin's down here, so here's the Verde, so this is where I spend most of my time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. Upper Basin, where we are. So we're actually outside of the basin now, but water from the basin, I do believe, comes across the divide and into Fort Collins, as it does for many Front Range cities. So when we think about what's the size of the basin and what's the watershed, the physical, natural watershed boundaries are these, but the actual use of that water expands beyond the natural boundaries. So we use water in a lot of different ways. So in the headwaters, there's a lot of farming, a lot of agriculture. We use it to produce hydropower. There's a lot of demands on the river. There's recreation. So this is a nice non-consumptive use of water. And then eventually the river makes its way to the ocean, or almost, some years. I know someone after me is going to talk more about the Delta, who probably knows a lot more about the Delta than me. So we're going to skip right over that. So, in talking about how do we restore and protect flows in the rivers in the West, there's this nice list, development of state regulations. Well, that's pretty hard, and I don't think that's getting any easier. Lawsuits seeking to uphold public trust doctrine. Lawsuits don't build trust, so those are often not great solutions. New appropriations for in-stream flow. Most of the water is already appropriated, so making new appropriations isn't necessarily going to add water to the river. You might get a piece of paper that says you get some water, but you only get that water when someone else is not using it. So that's maybe not the best option either. Acquisition or lease of existing water rights to meet dedicated in-stream environmental and recreational needs. This is a really great option, and this is really the foundation of how to do water transactions. It's ideal to be able to do it through a legal system with acquisition. There's also other ways to get water in stream without going through the legal system. In Arizona, we don't have quite as simple of a legal system as Colorado, or you could argue it's much more simple, and you can't get through it, so it's pretty simple in that way. So most of our work in the Verde and in the lower basin is based on filing agreements and sharing agreements rather than through leases or transfers, as we work out how do we do some of these more permanent type of transactions. And then increasing efficiency in water systems. So we know that, before Chris, I believe, mentioned consumptive and non-consumptive use, and I wanted to just define that term a little bit more for folks. When we think about water transaction and how is water used, particularly around the riparian system, it's pretty important. So the consumptive use of water is the amount of water that's actually taken out of the system that does not return to the system. So in an agricultural use of water, that's considered a consumptive use of water, but not that entire portion of water is used consumptively. So if a farmer is flood irrigating, it might take him 8 acre-feet of water to be diverted out of the river, put onto the field, and then to produce his crop. But the consumptive use of that water is probably closer to 4 acre-feet, particularly for us in Arizona. For Colorado, you guys are looking more in the 3 acre-feet range. So that extra water that's not consumptively used by the crop is going somewhere else. It's either seeping back into the shallow groundwater table near the fields and slowly seeping back, or it's feeding the riparian corridor that's between the farm field and the river. So when we think about how water is managed, it's important to think about what's the actual crop using, and then what's another amount of water. So one of the ways we can actually put more water back in the river to benefit riparian systems in particular is increasing the efficiency in which the water is used on farm and in the ditch system. So these ditches take far more water than might be needed to grow a crop, and by putting infrastructure in place, you can improve flow in those regions. While you might not be addressing things like structural deficits in the Colorado River and freeing up more water for municipalities, from a restoration perspective, sometimes improving irrigation efficiency is really a great thing for your buck. So it's one to really think about as you manage that. So why do we need water markets? Why do we need water transactions? Well, I think we've kind of covered it. This guy has a right to use water. His right to use water probably goes back far before people were kayaking in Colorado. It might go back to the late 1800s, and he might be the senior user. And he may have the right to take all the water out of this stream. So the only way to change that is to work with that farmer and to create markets and transactions where you can put water back in the river to protect for these other uses, riparian use, for recreation, for fish, for wildlife. So we need to be able to work with the folks who do have the senior water rights. So just a little bit about how many transactions are actually occurring. You can see the Colorado Basin, in case you have not memorized the 7 basin states. There's Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. California also gets a lot of our water, so they're kind of honorary members. There's a lot of transactions, particularly environmental transactions in the Northwest around the Columbia Basin system. There's lots of transactions, lots of volume. California is obviously a water short place. There's a lot of transactions around moving water. Nor in the lower basin, there are a few transactions, and that is predominantly because of our legal system. It's very difficult to do transactions that are recorded in this way. So what the Nature Conservancy is working on is how do we do more transactions to get more water back in the rivers and create more flexibility in the system. So what is a water transaction, in case you're curious? We at the Nature Conservancy broadly define environmental water transactions as pretty much any agreement where you pay a water user to change what they're doing. We have all kinds of names for that: dry year option, crop substitution, split season leases, groundwater recharge, alternative water sources. So moving someone from a small stream to a big river can have a big impact on a riparian corridor or fish habitat. So there's a lot of ways in which we can work with farmers, ranchers, even local municipalities, small rural communities, in changing the way they manage water to put that water back in the river. We're going to talk a little bit tomorrow, just going to plug our talk for tomorrow with Tim about growing beer and beer. So we'll talk more about crop substitution then, but that's probably my favorite type of water transaction. So do tune in for that tomorrow morning. In case you want to know more. And then how do you get from a water transaction to a water market? So, we can do one transaction and it can have a very small localized impact, or sometimes we do one transaction and the ecological benefit is really hard to measure. And it's hard to imagine how do you get 0.1 CFS to turn into something big, but that 0.1 CFS can be the first step in creating a market and is therefore just as important as the next steps that come along. So working with small producers and changing their water use, these can be things like installing a new pipe gate with a farmer to change the way their water comes off the river and goes down ditch. So what we kind of look at, is the short-term transaction, multiple transactions. One of the tricky parts of water transactions is figuring out what do you pay a farmer, what do you pay someone to change their water use, what's the real value in that water. So as we start to do more transactions and work with more landowners, we start to understand what's the price point, where do people actually change their behavior. We don't want to pay so much that we can't afford to do more, but we don't want to pay so little that you can't actually do anything. So, this is actually, from a water perspective, this is a really important place to get to, is figuring out how much is this work worth. When you're going out doing stream restoration, you can get an estimate on how much it's going to cost to run a bulldozer. You're going to get a cost estimate on how many trees. And you can get all of these estimates and that's how much the project costs. When you're paying to change someone's behavior, it's a lot harder to understand what is it going to take to do that. So we look at things around how much will it cost for them to replace the value they were getting from that farming. So if they're using that pasture for grazing, how much will it cost to replace that grazing with hay? So trying to understand what makes the difference for different users. And then as we get more and more transactions, we see more ecological response, more riparian response, and start to develop a market. I would say most water markets in the Colorado Basin really aren't here. We're somewhere down here, trying to understand how much does it cost to do this, how do we get more people to enroll, and how do we document the impacts of our work. So for the Nature Conservancy and our partners, our theory of change really is that we need to do more transactions. As we do more transactions, we can start creating the enabling conditions. The enabling conditions for doing transactions are the laws that are in place that allow us to do this, the physical infrastructure in place to do this. You can ask a farmer to use less water on farm, and if he switches from flood to drip irrigation, but that doesn't change the way the ditch takes water from the river and puts it on the farm, you haven't actually saved any water in that region of the river. So making sure you have the physical infrastructure, a legal system where you're not jeopardizing someone's water right, and willing landowners in the social setting where people are not feeling threatened by these actions. As we start to develop more transactions, enabling conditions, and funding becomes that next piece. We have to pay for this. Farmers and ranchers live on the land. They expect to make their income from the land. We can't expect them to change their behavior and lose profits next year. I'm pretty sure most of you don't want to get paid half as much and do just as much work next year, and neither does the farmer. So he needs sources of income, and as we change his operations, making sure we're providing funding for that, but also funding the infrastructure that is needed. So drip irrigation is really expensive. So we worked on a project about 2 years ago, and we had students from the grade school come out, and they were very excited. It was really fun. They wanted to interview me, and I was in the middle of putting in drip irrigation, and we didn't have enough actual farm labor to do the drip irrigation project, so I and my airport were out there digging holes and trying to figure out how to install drip tape. And the students from Brand were, why wouldn't everybody just switch to drip? It's so much more efficient. This is a great way to use water. Why wouldn't every farmer want this? This will just come to work. It'll be fine. We'll have a fun time. And so they showed up the first morning and they were very excited, and they started digging holes, and about noon they looked really tired. At about 3 o'clock they were wondering when we were going to be done. At about 5 o'clock they said, you guys just can go home now. You look exhausted. And about 8 o'clock that night they called to ask, if we were done. And said, no, we've got about 2 more hours to go, but we'll see you all in the morning at 6 a.m. They got up the next morning, they got there at 6 a.m., they looked exhausted, they asked how long we were going to work. And I said, well, we'll probably be here until the sun goes down, and then we got some lights. We're going to do this again, because we got to plant the crop in the next 3 days if we're going to make it to market. And then they said, no, why people don't do PRIP. This is really, really hard. And it's really, really expensive. It's about $2,000 to $3,000 an acre to install PRIP. So it's a lot of capital for a farmer to put up. And we are working with Natural Resource Conservation Service to help fund some of these projects. So in Arizona, we have a regional conservation partnership program to start installing more efficient irrigation. And I think that's also pretty common throughout Colorado. I think there's 2 RCPP programs up here to work on infrastructure. So funding can also come from private sources. Pepsi, Coca-Cola have been great funders to work with. We've also gotten funding from other corporations. Bonneville Environmental Foundation has been another great funder. So just to kind of wrap up a little bit, opportunities for transactions and riparian restoration to coordinate. This might seem a little disconnected sometimes from the riparian restoration, but it works very well together. We're often working with the same landowners, so it's important to be conveying similar messages. Working on riparian restoration is often a way that landowners can feel comfortable talking about conservation. When you talk about removing tamarisk, it's non-threatening. When you talk about salt cedar or Russian olive or these invasive farmers can relate to and say, yeah, those don't belong here. You can build a relationship with them and they can build on some other more complicated issues around water use. So, I think that's kind of our pitch for working together with water transactions and other types of restoration is we have the same landowners, we have the same mission essentially is restoring our rivers and developing more ways to work together and build better partnerships. And actually, that's the end of my slides. So, if I answered all of your questions, I'll be really shocked. So, if you guys have questions, happy to answer them. But nothing about Colorado. Or I'll just have to make the answer up, which I will do.
When you talk about transactions, do those just need to involve the 2 parties making the transaction, or did everybody downstream do the same?
So it depends. Typically, the transaction is